All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this special reading sponsored by the Program on the African American and Africana Studies, the Commonwealth Institute of Black Studies at the University of Kentucky, and with support from the English Department and others. We are honored today to hear from Frank X. Walker's new book, his 13th book. And a little bit about Frank X. Walker. I'm not going to read his entire biography, it is in the chat, but a little bit about Frank X. Walker. He's a native of Danville, Kentucky, former poet laureate of the state of Kentucky. He's the founding member of the Appalachian Poets, an editor of America, What's My Name? The Other Poets Unfurl the Flag, Pluck, the Literary Journal, and others. It's also notable to talk about Frank as a painter. And the painting on the cover of the book you painted, right?
Yes.
The image on the cover of the book, right. As a painter and an interdisciplinary and a filmmaker, interdisciplinary author. So without further ado, I'd like to hear from Frank X. Walker.
Okay. Let's adjust your expectations, first of all. I think that in the wake of what is happening in real time, I mean, given that many of us, I imagine, if you love poetry, you probably are invested in political outcomes and what happens in the real world too, which means that you were likely watching some of last night's election returns and are still holding one ear to updates. And quite possibly might, like me, be experiencing what I always call an election hangover, an emotional kind of exhaustion and response. I had the same thing in 2016 and 2000 for obvious reasons, but this one seems, I think, heavier because I was up later, trying to catch updates. I won't replay them here. If you're interested, you already know all the details, but I'm going to be reading from a collection called Masked Men Black, Pandemic and Protest Poems. And these were poems that began in April of this year, not as a book, but initially in response to my contribution to National Poetry Month. And one of the things that I do regularly every year is to try to participate in what we call the Dirty 30, which is to write a poem a day for the month of April. And this year, because of the already impactful and huge presence of the pandemic, I made a conscious decision to try to just write about what was happening in real time as a documentarian, if nothing else, and see how long that would last. So I made it all the way through April, writing just about the pandemic's impact on me, my immediate family, my community, the neighborhood, what was happening nationally. Probably watch more news than I usually do, but I just wanted to keep up with the numbers, especially when things started to peak in our worlds. But what I found is that when May came along, I wasn't able to stop. So I kept writing and continued with that particular theme until the protests started to dominate the news. And so I started also writing about the protests. They seemed to be tied together for me. And this work continued on into early July. Accents Publishing publisher, Katerina Sokova, was watching these poems, come to life, because I also made the decision to share them in an early draft form every morning on Facebook. So there were a handful of people who had been reading them and were aware of the process. And she, in her wisdom, decided that, it's worth putting into a book. The reason this book exists because of her interest in the poems and their place in the world. And I think we both agree that, it's part of our responsibility to talk about what's happening right now on the ground. And I think these poems try to do that. So I'm going to just read a whole chunk of poems. I don't know how many, I'll try to go until it feels right or my throat says otherwise. And if you have questions or comments, there'll be plenty of time at the end to engage you. I've been reading from these poems for about a month now, but in small sections. So I'm going to add more poems than I usually read, because I think they are applicable to what has happened in the last 12 hours, and 24 hours even. And save your questions to the end, or send them in the chat. Although if you send them in the chat, I may not have a chance to read them. So here we go. I'm going to start out with a poem that is about one of the early surprises of the pandemic for me. I'm often accused of being an optimist, and making an effort to try to see the good in anything, try to see the silver lining, or as economists say, the opportunity cost of even a bad thing. What's the good thing that comes out of it? This first poem is called Silver Lining. Remembering you actually like your family, love your partner, and being outdoors barefoot, finishing the unread stack of books, cooking without using a microwave, and writing letters longhand. Noticing that watching, listening, or playing in the rain feels the exact opposite of driving in it. Meeting the old you, the cloud-watching wannabe gardener, before time clocks and hurry, bills and worry made you a prisoner. Took your life hostage, replaced it with cable, a big screen, and a remote control. So some of the positives for me, obviously, was getting real acquainted with my family, spending. You don't know how much you like or dislike a person until you are forced to spend 24 hours with them every day, sequestered in the house, maybe on the same sofa, but definitely in the same room, for, I guess now for us, 7, 8, 9 months in a row. So I imagine there are a lot of people out there that, are waiting for the end of COVID to either get remarried or immediately divorced. Because that kind of pressure, either bonds you tighter or I think blows you up. I'm hearing from a lot of people around the country who are on both sides of that coin. One of the things that we found out once we got tired of Netflix and binging every evening is that we had all this extra time because we weren't commuting. We weren't dropping teenagers off at soccer or basketball practice or picking up the 2-year-old from daycare. And we weren't going to the mall or shopping or restaurants. So, there were hours and hours of extra time every day that we weren't spending watching television. And so we were looking for other things to do that were productive, constructive, and useful. And for the first time together, we planted 3 raised bed gardens on the side of our house and in the backyard, and became gardeners. We also bought a bird feeder every 2 weeks, and to the point where we had 5, so we could look out the windows all over the house and watch birds.
I think before it was a time issue. We never really felt like we had time to just sit and watch birds feed. And there's something very soothing and meditative about both of those things, you know, not just feeding the birds, but watching them eat and waiting for them and believing you recognize individual birds after 8 or 9 trips. But the gardening was even more meditative and therapeutic. There's something about digging your hands in the dirt, growing your own food, you know, picking a tomato off the vine, bringing it in the house, washing it off, slicing it, and deep frying it and serving it as fried green tomatoes or part of dinner. There's something holy about that, I think. Something that for me